And we are live with our 196th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Seth Law, at Seth Law on Twitter. Seth, say hi.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. We've got our first post. Woohoo! Welcome. We're back at it. We got a few things to talk about this week. We've got guests coming up over the next month. Quite a few, actually, that are already scheduled. I think you can already see them on the YouTube channel and some of the upcoming episodes, but we'll be promoting those as well. Ken and I are both going to be in Phoenix in a couple of days for Cactus Con. If you are there, please let us know. We'd love to see you either in the workshop. We'd love to go out and get drinks, or just talk AppSec in general. We have the workshop on Saturday morning, and then we're doing a state of AppSec, which we will broadcast over the channel as well during the conference. We'll see how that goes. We've been working with the conference organizers on making sure that we have the technical capability to do that. And most likely, we'll pull in Mike McCabe from MBM Consultants to talk about current state of AppSec, and probably a couple others from the conference. It would probably just depend on who's available and how we're feeling that day after a workshop session. Otherwise, if you are looking for secure code review training, our first public offering of 2023 will be the DEF CON trainings in Bellevue, Washington, up in Seattle in April. I think we're teaching, I believe it's the 13th and 14th, if I remember right, Ken.
So for DEF CON, it's 12th. I thought it was 12th and 13th, but I could be,
No, it's 13th, 14th. We're also trying to balance out Kernel.
That was Kernel. Yeah, that was 12th, 13th.
Yeah, 12th, 13th. So whatever happens, we're going to make sure that people get covered, and we're teaching the course. We've got a couple of other resources that we can pull in to make sure that we get everything covered properly. But that's where it's at. So either of those will be an opportunity. The DEF CON one, we are updating content for the course in general, just to make things a little bit more streamlined, and also to pull in more open source code bases as we do secure code review. I think that's everything that's on my list. Ken, you have anything else?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, because last year, towards the end of, I don't remember which episode, I kind of teased out, I'll have some more, I'll have something to talk about. And I had to wait a little bit. So I'll just say it. Next month will be my last month. So it's January. Yeah, February will be my last month at GitHub. I am leaving. I love GitHub. Has nothing to do with GitHub. Huge fan of all the folks there. Really sad to say goodbye after almost, it's been nearly 5.5 years with them. Yeah, it's been a while. But very excited. I got to remember what I'm allowed to say at this stage. So I'm building a company with James Wickett. If you're not familiar with James, he's got he's put on. He was the original kind of creator of LastCon. I think it's now in other people's hands, and DevOps Days Austin as well. He worked with others to build out DevOps Days Austin, and he was like one of the early employees at Signal Sciences. I think employee number one, actually, after, obviously the founders. And then let's see what else. He's got like a LinkedIn learning course that's really popular with Karthik on I think it's DevSecOps. So anyways, I know I'm allowed to say that we're going to be building some security tooling, trying to make some security tooling cool again, type deal. But applicable to today's landscape, we'll say. But anyways, it's all very exciting. It's a huge chapter. We're in stealth mode for a bit. There'll be more announcements about what we're doing in a few months. But yeah, we're funded. We have a company ready to go. So anyways, that was the stuff I was kind of teasing out, and this is it's happening. So I just wanted to kind of make that announcement. So that's about it.
Well, congratulations. Obviously I've been a little bit more privy to those discussions and that life changes. We've been talking the last, few months on what does Ken's life look like, right? But congratulations. I think it's going to be a good ride, and always exciting to see what's coming down the pipe, like what you guys are coming up with. I'm sure we'll have a lot more discussions on it once you can publicly talk about it more and, things get launched, right?
Well, I apply for GitHub now that they will have an opening. Yeah, no, I don't think they're doing any hiring at the moment, but it's a good call. I know you're joking, but I don't think they're doing hiring at the moment.
That being said, though, if you do have a job, or if you're looking for one, the jobs channel in Slack has been fairly active. There's been a few things posted over the last over the last couple of weeks. I know there's been a lot of things going on, across the industry and layoffs happening. So let us know if you know of jobs, or check that channel if you want.
Yeah, I've seen an uptick. You're right. Like, definitely there's, and actually, that's the thing is, like, right now, I hate to say this because, it's very unfortunate for people that are getting laid off, but for those that need good people, it's pretty fortunate time. There's a lot of talent out there now, to your point. But yeah, man, I don't know. I'm just excited. It's going to be a really good time. I'm sad to leave GitHub because, obviously, like, I'm a huge GitHub fanboy. Always will be. Still am. Always will be. Always have been. So anyways,
that's it. So from now on out, we're going to be sponsored by GitLab, right? Is that what that's?
God, just that's hilarious. No, I love GitHub, but it's one of those things. Like, the thing is how this feels when you're middle aged, right? Like, I'm turning 40 this year, not that far away, and you start reassessing, like, how much do I have left in me to go out and build a company before? Obviously, you've done it before, I've done it before, and there's still a desire to build something that is really cool. So in any case, personal desire, nothing to do with that, with GitHub. So so that's really fun. It's going to be, like, pretty crazy, and and then I guess this weekend we've got CactusCon, so that's going to be a lot of fun meeting up with people. I hope that do you remember the comic book store we went out to at CactusCon? When we had lunch at, like, a Mexican place, and, like, next to it was a Mexican restaurant, and then next to it was, like, the comic book store that had just, like, crazy good stuff in it.
I do, actually. Yeah, I remember wandering through there. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't know. I don't live down there, right?
And it was pre-COVID, and it was probably, like, you know what, dude? That was almost 6 years ago. It was 5.5 years. It was actually right as I started at GitHub, I think.
Yeah, it probably was. That being said, it's pretty close to the conference center, so I think it is. Gotham City Comics still exists. Yes. So awesome. We'll have to go wander in and check it out. See how things have gone there. You come to Absolute AppSec for comic news and travel advice, right? That's.
I think they come here to. I don't know. I don't know why people come here. So
I don't know. Yeah,
we'll throw everything at you. See what makes sense.
See what sticks. We're gonna pivot.
Exactly.
We're gonna start reviewing comics, right? Yeah, there we go. Graphic novels. Yeah.
Hey, what you do in the privacy of your own home, Seth, is up to you. All right. We're here to talk about technology. Sweet. You over here with your graphic novels.
Exactly.
Anyways, moving on.
What should we talk about today? The first thing that I did, that was on my mind, just because Jason on Slack was bringing it up yesterday, was microservices, right? And the question that he asked that I wanted to highlight is fairly interesting, right? Any folks have, so this is Misfire 3 or Misfire 3, however you say it, Misfire, whatever, Jason.
Who's a coworker of mine right now.
Yep, he's over at GitHub, but he does have a question around it. So he says, any folks have insight on secure code review relative to microservices, how you potentially approach it differently from monoliths? And then namely thinking of IDing potentially risky attack surfaces. And I'm primarily thinking of inputs as attack surfaces in this scenario, but also realize I might have the wrong model there. So that was going to be my question to you, right? Like I chimed in a little bit in Slack, but your team from like a offensive security perspective, if you come up against a microservice, what is it that you're thinking about from an attack surface perspective? How do you go after it?
Yeah, the common things are kind of like so like basic hygiene type things are the first layer. Service to service
Okay.
auth is usually like the important one, right? Like especially obviously amongst microservices, there should be service to service auth. I know you're gonna love this. Logging and auditing, basically telemetry. That's going to be important. In terms of like basic security hygiene and stuff. And then as we look at attacks, obviously one that's pretty prevalent is server-side request forgery, just because a lot of these services are making web calls out to other services. So that's always something to be cognizant of, I guess, is like SSRF. But when it comes specifically to microservices edge cases, which I think is another layer that people might want to, like, maybe that's part of the question, right? Is really, this is like such a weird thing that happens, but there will be some front end system. I don't know, like it could be a web app that you developed. It could be like AWS's, service, like a cloud set of services where they put out all the routes, and then there's like services to do off, whatever, right? There is a front end that takes information from someone and then parses that, makes some decisions, repackages that data up, most commonly repackages that data up, and then gives it off to microservices. And then somewhere in between there were decisions made upon the data structure that came in. And then that information was gobbled back together in a different way and then passed on to the backend, or maybe just passed through, but perhaps certain parts of the request were used to process decisions on the front end. And those same parts different parts were used to make other decisions on the back end. And why I'm saying this is, like, we've definitely had authorization issues because the front end said, well, hey, based off of, we'll say some parameter in the URL, the path, and based off of some header, we took those two values and said, you know what, you're allowed to do what you're asking for. Except that when we repackaged the data and forwarded it on the back end, who is just assuming that the front end did all the proper authorization, like they're not doing any additional authorization, right? They're assuming that was done. They're then reading maybe a different element in the request. And they're saying, like, why I'm saying this is, like, sometimes your middleware layers, like, they look at, if you ask for params, it could be a param in the body. It could be a param in it could be a post request that you're sending params in a body. But if you also send the params in the HTTP path, maybe that's being respected. It's just whatever oddity and edge case that backend has, right? So there might be some other header that's actually being respected. And then it's like, okay, well, there's a mismatch. Like, you're now editing or doing something with some resource that you weren't authorized for. They were using another part of the request and saying that's what you were authorized for, but like the backend didn't know that. So I know that's really abstract without a diagram, but I think that's really the one that I see, and that's why I'm trying to just like summarize it with like mismatch of expectations and how data gets processed between the front end and the back end systems.
Yeah,
that's a really long tangent. Sorry.
No, I mean, it's a good call out because that is an edge case. A lot of times, so when I analyze microservices, especially as a consultant coming into an organization, they only give me access to the microservice, right? And that's like what you're bringing up is always the point that I try to make to them is that, depending on how your microservice handles all of these different edge cases and the data that's being thrown at it, it can introduce security flaws or problems that you didn't intend, because we're not doing a full integration test or a full security integration test because we are just looking at the microservice. And I mean, this is, traditionally the problem that we have in the security services space is that we get scoped to a very specific, right? technology, a very specific application, a very specific microservice, and we don't really see it running in its full production environment. And so those edge cases are things that we cannot test for, right? I can't find a problem with the communication between, the web application and the backend microservice if I don't have access to the front end web application to exercise all of those different paths that exist. And some of the most interesting vulnerabilities that we see, especially coming out of the bug bounty programs, come from those edge cases. And that's the reason why you kind of want to pair it. Like, I know I'm coming from a security consulting perspective, and right, like you're probably paying us to do code review or something like that is very scoped, but that's why you should also have a bug bounty program, right? Like I'm going to tell you that all day long because I know that there's those edge cases. And I think you would say the same thing coming from GitHub is you've got this multi-pronged approach for finding vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah. Our teams and our tooling don't have the same focus and time that a researcher might have for the less or for the more complicated things that take much more time to discover and are definitely not something you could just easily, review and find. Right. Yeah. So yes, you're right with bug bounty programs. And also because to your point, like, so you're seeing an application code, you're seeing code bases but only the like a half of the code bases because like, even if you're not like, even if you had the front end applications, like code and the back end's code, there's still this other set of software that's running like Varnish or whatever it might be, WAFs, proxies, reverse proxies,
Nginx,
whatever. Right. And that's all software. So that's all that software that's running that can't be really analyzed. Well, it doesn't make sense to look for the vulnerabilities we would look for without runtime access, honestly. Like that's so even if you have the front end source code, the back end source code, you still have this other software that needs to be tested, but probably not statically. You can look at rules and whatnot, but probably not statically. It's probably much quicker to just send some fuzzing, like for web cache poisoning or for request smuggling or whatever it might be that makes sense. So anyways,
yeah. I mean, one of the interesting ones that I've been playing with a lot recently when it comes to, those sorts of environment microservices specifically is, regular expression abuse, right? And not necessarily the denial of service, but this, for routing and, SSRF like style preventions that people put into place, a lot of times they use these deny lists or block lists to prevent bad things from happening, right? So as long as the URL contains, a proper host name, for example, then it's allowed to go out. That would be more of an accept list, right? But it's very easy to add that in, embedded in other parameters or other things to get by those regular expressions. What I'm finding is and I know this is a developer as well, it's very hard to write a regular expression that only accepts the data that you specifically want, especially in the context of a dynamic application that is sending tons of routes or send tons of data, and you've got multiple locations that you're trying to let it go out to, or multiple IP addresses that it needs to be able to interact with. Most recently we've seen some, accept lists that were built around access and accidentally, they didn't realize that the accept list would accept the IP address that was contained in the X forwarded for header, right?
Right.
And so even though there wasn't like 127.0.0.1, it had public IPs for this organization included in that list. And all we had to do is go out to Aaron and look up the public IPs that were associated with that organizations, enumerate them all. And at some point we found one that worked, right? Like an external interface or whatever coming out from that organization going to this Amazon service or Azure service, I think it was, because it was like an IP list that was built into the application itself. And so we had to have discussions about, okay, if you're doing a get remote IP in .NET, right? Like, what does that actually give you, right? because the get remote IP, it'll look up the network stack, but it also accepts that X forwarded for header as a valid value for remote IP. And once it's in there, right, like you're making security decisions based upon that. Hey, guess what? You can bypass that control that exists. But again, that's playing with these regular expressions and how we trust the code, how we trust the frameworks that we're putting into place. Because if I was to look at the code itself, it looked fairly innocuous, right? It was just like doing a comparison of what's the remote IP, and here's my list of valid IPs. But we were able to bypass that because of the conditions that exist and where it would actually pull from. So that was one. URL encoded values is a very fun one to play with as well. Right, you're denying /admin in the URL from any IP address except the ones that you want to accept. But in the URL, if you put in a %65 admin or %61, yeah. DMIN.
If you don't know this, Seth, you're not a professional. No, I'm joking.
I know, exactly. Yeah, that's what burp decoder is for, so I can quickly flip between URL encoded values, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, if you URL encode some of those values, especially when you have like Nginx is or F5 or some WAF is implementing an access control list based on a URL, it doesn't see that, it doesn't match that. Specifically because it's looking for a DMIN and not the URL encoded value there. But when it sends it to the server behind the scenes, like the WAF turns around and says, okay, this looks good, sends it to Apache does a URL decode on that and allows that access to be established. And again, it's just playing with those regular expressions, recognizing where those controls exist. I've started to put a lot more effort into, okay, I get an error message back about something is blocked. Why is it blocked, right? Especially from a dynamic perspective. But if it is in the code itself, let's take a look at that. Like, just don't take it with, don't take it for gospel, I guess, until you've tested it. Just because it says something is denied doesn't mean you can't find your way around it. And I mean, that's what the bug bounty researchers do as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing with microservices in general, or just a lot of software stacked software, is that, yeah, you're going to run into all these things that are very hard to find statically. It's very hard to find statically and much quicker to find dynamically. But of course, there's downsides to that too. But ultimately, it's that weird thing of when you have this much software working together in unison, cobbled together, there has to be, because of the different layers of that stack, data translations that occur, some massaging of the data, parsing of the data, reparsing. By the time it gets to wherever it needs to go, there's a lot of places where things had to be all kind of done uniformly, but they're not done uniformly. It's different tech stacks. And so that's, that's, I saw the response to the burp decoder. Yeah, we were just joking. Like, I can't remember all that stuff. Like, I used to be able to, but I can't remember all the symbols anymore. But anyways, You're right. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, and then so like you have to kind of segment out what things you look for statically, what things you look for dynamically is my major takeaway. And when it comes to microservices and it comes to layers of the tech stack, you kind of have to, it's a blended approach.
Yeah, and then I mean the other thing that I called out in Slack was input validation, right? And output encoding, right? Basically being a good data steward when it comes to being a microservice. If I am getting data that is unexpected in string variables, I should at least be encoding that. There's so many of these services will spit back HTML in error messages, or HTML characters in response values, just because they don't necessarily care what the strings are, because they're processing, and which is great. That's what you want a microservice to do, but they're not recognizing the risks that's associated with it. And when we start taking this layered security approach, that's what I'm going to expect a secure service to do, is actually, it not be the weak link in that chain. yes, it probably shouldn't get back to the microservice if there is, HTML characters in a, in a name or something like that. But I would rather have that catch it than push it back to the database and have it redisplayed, right? Like there's just so many places that we can catch this stuff, like the technologies you're talking about, Ken. And if each one has got to have its own security mechanisms and security validations built into it. And so I've gotten pushback on that in the past, right, from different developers that they're like, well, the microservice isn't where we want to implement that. I'm like saying, but why not, right? Like, if you've got the capability there to actually test whether something is an integer, and you're failing if it's not, if it's not in the value that you expect, why can't you do the same thing with strings? Because you should, right? I don't know if that's a larger argument to be made or if that's one that you've seen.
I could see I could see keeping the data as is. And I could also, meaning I could see an argument for that. But if you're going to do that, then there has to be some, you have to have work with other engineers to architect like expectations around, okay, so when does the data, what do we do with it? When does it become something, how we sandboxed ourselves so that, any of that kind of data is like, we're cool with just passing it on, and then making sure there's clear expectations that no, once it hits this security boundary, then it has to be normalized. However, I'm saying that because there's always caveats to the advice we give. And of course, there may be times where it needs the raw data and not to do any translations or modifications of that data. Having said that, though, on the accounting for that caveat in that edge case, yes, I agree with you. Like that is something people don't do. There are, most, I guess you get into the situation of how like down the rabbit, like when you talk about the a microservice, it's usually written in something that doesn't have like a ton of features, right? It's not like, say, like Ruby on Rails that has like nice little validation routines you can neatly attach to any of the content that's being put into a column in a table in a database, right? You can do that very easily. You can overwrite validations. Like if there were validations you imported that were like doing things, meaning you imported a library and it was inherently doing stuff, you can even overwrite those validations and do your own. You can say, to your point, you can say, well, listen, these columns are only going to be these types of these data points, right? You can do all that stuff usually very conveniently with other with like more opinionated, heavy-handed frameworks, but you can't really do it as easily. You can, but it's not as convenient, I would say, in the technology stacks that a lot of microservices are built in. So you have to be very explicit about it, and that's obviously like a difficult thing.
Yeah. Well, and it's part of that flexibility, right? And I get it. I've actually analyzed quite a few microservices running through some things like MuleSoft, right? Where it's not necessarily a coder that is implementing the microservice, because they're doing some sort of data translation from one service to another, or whatever that is. And that's typically the pushback that I get is, well, oh, it's MuleSoft, it's fine. I'm like, yeah, you say that, but then all of a sudden I'm seeing like strange things show up in Salesforce because you're pushing all this data through this microservice to Salesforce, and it has unintended consequences because you weren't a good data steward with that, right? Like you didn't validate it. And that's, you start talking about ETL tools in a large corporate environment. That's one of the things that I expect to see is the cleaning of data, right? I don't know. I go back and forth on that one, but I do report it. I get pushback on it. I'm okay with that, right? Because at least it starts the conversation and it forces them to justify their decisions rather than just, oh, we're not going to worry about it with this microservice specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway. Is no, because it's not a one. That's the difficulty here. It's not a one size all fits solution. But yeah, that's definitely a problem. It's funny because going back to what you were mentioning about the IP allow list and like the data being like different than as a traverses. Like Neil Matatal, NDM, who we've had here a bunch, right? He did some. We had some allow or deny list for IPs for something. I forget what. So he was working on it, and I think that there was some frustration for sure because of the values that should have been passed in weren't being seen. And instead, I don't remember the exact details, but I want to say it was almost like he was seeing the IP of like the front end systems only and not like the actual request or something like that. There was some data mismatch between what was happening in the front before. And this isn't even like a microservice. This is just like this regular web stack that has like multiple pieces, running in front of the application that do something with the data. And so anyways, it's kind of funny, man. Like things are hard.
Things are hard.
Applications are hard. Yeah.
Applications
and it's only getting more difficult. It's not getting easier. In some ways it gets easier, but in many other respects it does not.
Yep. Yes. Well, good.
We're like 38 minutes in or 31 minutes in.
Yeah. I know. And all we've talked about is API security. I mean, there's a lot to cover there, right? Like I just, I mean, you kind of brushed over some of the base level stuff too, right? Like your authentication and authorization, especially service to service authentication and authorization. But it's very much like a database call or something else, right? Like you want to have some layer of security there so that in the case that someone gets access to like the web server, like that front end web server, they can't just walk into that web service without at least providing some credentials, at least figuring out something else. Like there's the security layered the layered security approach is kind of what we want across the board when it comes to these different components.
Yeah, because if you exploit some system that's living inside of, let's say you're like all in the same like cluster, right? And so your apps can talk to each other once you're inside the cluster, but like, from outside, no. But somehow you've compromised one service or got an RC or whatever. It's like, well, okay, cool. Do you really want, a potential RC or even just SSRF, right? To then potentially equal a compromise of another microservice because there's no service to service auth. There's no like, hey, this request should have this, data minted on. Not to say there aren't workarounds if you're like literally have RC and you work, like inside the application. But anyways, my point is you want to make it harder, right? And anyways, which is why auditing then in that case or telemetry becomes very, very important.
Yep, definitely does. So. Well, good. Okay, so that's API security. The other article that I had pulled up for today, and I mean, we got a couple more. This one's on dev.to, right? Dev.to. And it's a post from earlier this month. But really, I wanted to use this to spur further discussion, right? So I'll post it here quickly. This Echelon Design is asking, or he's saying, don't skip on security, add these must-have features to your web apps. And so he's built a list of, I think it's 5 or 6 different things that your web, or Ash Allen, I should say, has built a list of 5 or 6 different things that he thinks are must-haves for security of an application. And, first off, right, like if we run through the list, he's got MFA, so multi-factor authentication, sending of suspicious activity notifications, right? Session management features, okay, whatever that, logging of users' activity, sending emails when users' email changes, notify when users' password is reset, checking for pwned passwords, and check for up-to-date information, allow granular permissions for API tokens. Okay, so that's it. So he's got like 8 items that are there. Mm-hmm. First of all, do you agree, or is there do you feel like there's something missing? Like he comes out of the gate with MFA. Is that something you think every web application should have?
The way you said, I would normally be like, yeah, of course. But now the way you said that, I'm like, well, this feels like a trap, man.
No, it's not. I'm not trying to make it a
Okay.
trap, right?
I mean,
But
I would,
yeah.
I mean, like, unless there's some like odd reason why you wouldn't, I would definitely say that would be, and I would honestly even step further and say, don't allow SMS unless, well, god dang. I mean, so if well, I can't say that either because some people don't understand or don't want to put an authenticator app on. SMS is easier. SMS is more prone to SIM swapping attacks and just general shenanigans like social engineering. So that's but then you have to factor in like context, right? Like how secure sensitive is the application, who's the user base, and all of that. So if you're a really sensitive application and you've got very technical users, yeah, I would say no, don't allow SMS, or at least not for any privileged users with privileges or permissions that are significant. If it is a I don't know, social media like Mastodon or something, like I don't care, like SMS it away, who cares? Like I mean I wouldn't care, but whatever. So I'm sure I could get torn apart for saying that, but in any case, whatever. So yeah, I agree. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more nuanced than just MFA everywhere, right? Sensitive applications, yes. I think it's more about user choice as well, right? Like you want to make your app as secure as possible, but you also want to give people the option to upgrade their security if they need to. So in the case of like Mastodon or Twitter, right? Like, yes, having SMS as MFA, that's great, right? But allow people to pick an option that is more secure, that they're more comfortable with, if that's something that they want, right? Like we've seen situations where those accounts, the access to those accounts because they have millions of followers, become an attack vector and a way to scam people. And so that's the sort of thing that you want to prevent from happening. I still find it interesting that there are quite a few just like banks and other online portals, financial information that don't necessarily require MFA, that don't have MFA enabled. But on the flip side, I've also seen those sorts of sensitive applications tend towards longer passphrases and encouraging users to use 12, 18, 20 characters in a password, which does also up the level of security there, right? So it's one of those like, okay, is MFA really necessary if you have a very strong or very strict password requirements? Yes, I like, depending on the application, it probably should still be an option, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is better or worse, especially when you let them choose like more insecure options when it comes to those MFA tokens or those, the sending of SMS or something else in those secure environments. So, I go back and forth on that one, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, I don't have a good answer for it, but it is very situational, at least for me personally. Let's see. He spends a lot of time talking about security, like activity notifications, whether that's passwords, whether that's logins, changing of the email address, logging of users' activity. I mean, so how crucial do you find those sorts of controls in a web application?
Well, in that one, it wouldn't be crucial until it is, right? So the same for like logging the user's activity, which is absolutely critical. So those things become crucial. They're the only after usually something has happened, right? So I would say they're pretty critical, but they won't feel like it maybe at first when you first deploy. The one thing that's not on here that I would like to see is the re-authentication after a certain amount of time for more dangerous operations, right? So there are things like, so let me finish that thought out and then praise them for one other thing. So yeah, long story short, if you see this on GitHub, for instance, if you want to delete some like an organization or delete or do something destructive, right, or security impacting or whatever, basically something that's sensitive, and we want to make sure that you're actually you. That's usually a good time to require, maybe using your UB key again to like validate like you're you still, or whatever, having some kind of wall that pops up and doesn't allow you to do stuff until you've attested to being you. So that's the one thing I think is missing. That's pretty important. I think the other thing though I want to praise them on is, man, the granular permissions for API tokens is so key, because if you remember, and I think most people do because it's still available, we have the personal access tokens at GitHub, and it's kind of there are scopes, but the scopes are pretty rough, right? Now those scopes are very granular in the personal access token PATs, as we call them, V2, the latest version. They're so much more granular. This is also why we moved away from OAuth apps to GitHub apps. Well, one of many reasons, but GitHub apps allow for, again, very granular permissions, both from what the app is allowed to do, and then the intersection of what the user who installed the app is allowed to do. So there's some pretty granular decisions that get made there. But starting with OAuth apps is rough, because imagine you authorize something, you get an access code. That access code just gets, that's like you, right? That access token is you, but you've used it to maybe authorize some third-party thing. It lives in that third-party system. Someone compromises that third-party system. You can see where I'm going with this. So, and then again, it's like totally you, not it's most privileged, not least privileged in that case. So, anyways, I just want to praise them very, very heavily on bringing that. They allow granular permissions for API token section, introducing that there.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, that's not the one that I see a lot in most web applications. It's typically I generate an API key and then I can use the API key as myself. But there aren't necessarily restrictions on what that API key can do, at least, or I'm not able to actually restrict it outside of, hey, now I have this API key that I can do something with. So I don't know. I mean, I looked through that list. Authentication, authorization, auditing is in there. The other thing that I feel like is missing is some sort of just like discussion on, like we've already touched on it a little bit today, but on data validation, right? What's being sent to the application, checking to see whether or not it's actually it is what you expected before acting on it. Right. It's one thing to be like, yeah, we watch for SQL injection, and I think was that in there? Not necessarily. Yeah, I don't see a discussion on that or following like framework security best practices. That's probably the other thing that I would include.
Oh, good point.
Is, I mean, he does say we know we need to prevent SQL injections, CSRF attacks, cross-site scripting attacks, and so on. However, these are usual security fixes. Yeah.
No. To your point, actually, because like a lot of the frameworks now have the ability to, if you read their documentation, they have a way to define a content security policy that gets replicated everywhere, like in the configuration files. So, like to your point, yeah, like that's actually, I can't believe I forgot about that. Like if you don't have CSP, like what are you doing? So
yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
Yeah. So like, I mean, to be fair, right? Like he's pushing, on, okay, what
these are security features for users though, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Not for like hardening the application.
Yeah. That's what it feels like is, these are features that he wants to discuss to encourage users to stay security conscious, like to know what's going on with that app and the security of their account specifically. And then allow them to be proactive about that while giving them confidence that you take it seriously. So I mean, honestly, like I feel like that's a good list for for presenting that face, right? Obviously, there's always going to be more things that we can add and we can nitpick. But in general, that's a good place to start, right? Like you have a consumer application, you want people to be, to be confident in the security of the application. Give them those features, and and then listen to your users about other things that they want to see, whether that is other options for MFA tokens, like the ability to actually use something like a YubiKey, if that's even necessary for your application.
Yeah. Man, we could probably riff on this one for a while. Because every time you say something, I'm like, man, what about this? What about that? There's a lot. I like the start, though. I like the start of this. I think it's someone wrote somewhere, one of these Slacks, or said, these are probably just things that everyone should do, but they don't. And so this is nice that someone's explicitly saying it, even if it is a PHP dev. I'm totally joking. Totally kidding.
Even if his book is all on like Laravel or whatever, right? Yeah.
It's okay. Battle tested Laravel.
Laravel. Wouldn't that be just like using Rails or something? No, just kidding, right?
Only in PHP. Sorry. I gotta stop with my PHP. I'm not much better. I don't know why I'm making fun of PHP when I've been a Ruby fanboy for or at least people think that, right? Yeah. Little do people know I can code very well in Ruby, but I just don't code in Ruby that often. Most of the times, literally like probably Python or Node or those are probably the two more like day to day. Anyways, long story short, I have nowhere. I don't have. I shouldn't speak. I shouldn't say anything. I don't have.
That's why we're going to move to what, Erlang or Go or just Rust, just to change it up a little bit.
Elixir for a little bit, and I liked it, but the Phoenix framework didn't have the uptake I had kind of expected. At least it hasn't so far.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, that brings us to another point, right? Like, I know we wanted to talk about this a little bit on the air today. Given that we're doing the workshop on Saturday, I wanted to pick out a project that we could actually analyze and then maybe repost some of the, or post the results in Slack and maybe on, social media as well, of anything that we find. So
after we tell them.
After we tell them, yes. We don't want to get into another situation.
Ken doesn't need any more Twitter DMs about how I'm the worst. So
we get enough of those. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So no, but are you asking the audience to give us a project or recommend projects? Is that kind of what we're saying?
Or is there anything on your radar? That
there is, but I don't remember what it is. Oh, there was actually, but I don't remember. I'll find it. There's we'll figure it out. But I would love to hear from the listeners though. So in Slack, if you feel like posting recommendations in general,
or even if it's just like a language and framework that you're interested in, like we've done that a couple of times on the After Dark episodes where we're pulling apart stuff that we haven't analyzed in the past, right? Just so if you've got a language or framework that you are that you would like to see, let us know. The other thing that we could do is turn to hunter.dev, because they have a bunch of projects that are listed and specific bounties associated with, with hunter.dev. And we've had those guys on in the past. So maybe we'll pull one of those projects and take a look at it. There's some interesting ones in there, right? Like Jupyter Notebook stuff, JavaScript apps, draw.io, right? Looks like that's one that's in there. I don't know how complex these applications are, so I don't know how much we'll actually get through in the 4 hours of the workshop that we have.
I know and I'm trying to find this thing, but anyways, I'm going to stop here because I'm stuck in my phone for a while. It's going to be, I'm trying to think, because there was a project. Anyways, all right. Sorry, it's bothering me because there's a project I have top of mind. But anyways, if you all think it's something, please put it in Slack. Otherwise, we'll just choose something, I guess, and we'll figure it out. So
Yeah.
That's kind of the goal, though, is to not be like proficient in whatever we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
It's no fun if we like did our homework and vetted this thing and like made sure it like fell into our specific skill sets. Like in the class, we tell people choose something that you don't know how to test. You don't understand it. It's not like your bread and butter, and then follow the methodology.
Yep. And I mean, that was it, right? Like recently at DeepSec, because that one I ended up doing on my own, right? And let's see. Yeah, there was.
Which I was really bummed about, but whatever. I next time I will be able to travel. It's a rough time.
Yeah, there was an app that I pulled out that was actually a Rails app, because I'm not as proficient at Ruby as I am at Python and some of the others. Was this one that was called Bridge Troll?
What?
Here, I'll show you. It's called Bridge Troll. Bridgetroll.org, right? It's an event scheduling application, right? So it allows you to, create events, sign in, sign up. Again, I had no knowledge of it. It was just one that the students picked out as we were going through the course that we found because we were looking at different Rails applications, and that was the walkthrough that I did. And I discount it at times, but it's like when you're biting off an open source application like that and attempting to analyze the security of that open source application, when there aren't things to necessarily find, it feels so true to life when we're doing a secure code review, right? Like Ken, most of the time when we do the courses, analyzes VTM, which is the vulnerable task manager that we've written. It's based on Python, Django, and has specific vulnerabilities that are in the code base, right? So there's always kind of that little payoff that you get, which is nice in a workshop format, because there's things for you can to analyze and say, hey, look, this is where they went wrong. This is what actually happened. But it's a lot harder with those open source applications, right? It's they use, somebody else found it previously. If they have a vulnerability, it's been patched. So there may not be as much surface or as many findings in that application, but that is very true to life, right? Like we nitpick, we find things. Sometimes they're, critical vulnerabilities, but the majority of the time it's probably a low, medium severity issue. Might be that you can add up a couple of them, if the code has never been looked at, to get to a critical or a high severity. But a lot of times it's just improving the overall security of that application and making sure that it doesn't have those soft, fuzzy edges that can cause problems down the line.
Yeah. I was looking at Bridge Troll. It looks pretty simple at first glance. But I wonder, that's first glance, right? Meaning like not the code, looking at the live running site. So,
Yeah.
So are you saying y'all didn't find much, or you did find a bunch? I just want to be clear.
No, we didn't.
You didn't find much.
Nope, we didn't find much. But I mean, we were able to follow the process, get the routes pulled out of it, all that kind of, all that jazz. But it's always an interesting exercise. Like, and yeah, at some point, you and I need to do another AppSec After Dark and break down some other code bases, and maybe the workshop will inspire that. I don't know. We may try and stream some of that. I haven't necessarily decided, or record some of it, see if there's some interesting stuff that pops out of it. It really depends on who shows up and what the environment looks like when we get to CactusCon, though.
Yeah. Well, they use Devise, so that's gonna
see, I mentioned that, and Ken's already looking at
I know, looking at all
actual
the
code. Yeah,
I know. I'm in the code now. Yeah.
He's starting to break it down. What is the first thing that we always say? Like information gathering. Okay, what are the dependent libraries? Like, oh, he pulls out Devise. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the first
maybe,
thing.
Maybe we'll revisit Bridge Troll. I don't know. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
One that's in the that's in the Slack channel was at the course there. It was good time, right? It was fun to do. So.
Well, they're using the sanitized gem. They're using OmniAuth. They're using rack cores. So there's definitely some security centric stuff. New Relic for telemetry. Anyways, Postgres for development. Yeah. Anyways, like there's some interesting stuff here, and then they've got their config file for devise. Oh, they have some devise overrides. We should maybe revisit this. But see, this is what I'm good at. We don't do that, right? We do what we're bad at. So, yeah. Anyway,
yeah, it looks like we found some like yeah. I mean, there were some sniffs around SQL injection and actually cross-site scripting as well. Looking at back at my notes, it might be interesting just to kind of revisit that on the podcast at some point to talk about what it was. But because I remember like we thought we had found SQL injection, but you couldn't actually trace it all the way through. So it was more of like a insecure building, like string concatenation for SQL, but that you couldn't get it from the user input itself. So it wasn't a full injection attack. Anyway, we'll definitely get back into that as we run through the workshop.
Absolutely. Yeah. They've got a lot of things that you could configure and devise that aren't. So anyways, whatever we end up choosing, we'll bring our findings back to this podcast. I think next week, next week we've got a special guest. Is that correct? Let me look.
Yes, I think you are correct.
So next week will be January 31st. Yeah. Sal Olivieras is joining us. I think this is from we met Sal through Leaf. I'm not mistaken. So
yeah, and he's got should be good.
Yeah, I know because that's what I was trying to remember. What was the new thing? I don't really remember off the top of my head. I read it and then
yeah, he's got a blog post that's coming out. Right. Let's see. Where am I looking here? Sorry, I'm trying to pull that back up. What the blog post actually was. Let's see. Yes. Sal submitted to B-Sides. He's working on a blog post about the things we're doing to help customers keep their API keys safe. That's what it is, right? So tracking of API usage. So a lot of what we were talking about today, it'll be interesting to pick his brain on what it is that Segment or Twilio now, right, like is actually doing to protect that API key, notifying owners when they want to delete keys. Interesting.
Yeah, I feel like Twilio and Segment Twilio really, right? I feel like they're becoming like kind of like the new Netflix of AppSec and / DevOps / CloudSec. I guess it's all related, or they're just releasing new tools and useful content like all the time for the open source consumption. It's pretty awesome to see really good folks over there.
Yeah, it is. I don't think that's been released yet, though. Now that I'm saying that, I hope we're not getting too far in front of where they're actually at, but I think it is going live here pretty soon. So it'll be interesting to talk to them about those features, that feature set, what it is that they like, what risks they have recognized. There you go. And, we'll talk more about that blog post as it comes out too.
And again, if you have any ideas for things we should be or a thing we should review at CactusCon Live, let us know. Put it in Slack. We'll take a look.
Yep. And I do have swag. I'll be bringing it. I'll be bringing some shirts to CactusCon. But if you would like a shirt or some stickers, just ping me on Slack, and we'll send it to your physical space. Can't necessarily do that over Slack. So.
I think I've got some shirts too, actually. I do. I have some, not many, but I have some shirts left over too. So I'll probably try and,
we'll coordinate that.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. So, cool.
All right.
Well,
Well, that's good. I think that's everything
Oh.
for this week. Yeah.
I'm not going to talk too much through it because there's, we don't need to. I just want people to be aware that this was released like a week and a half ago or so. Just because it's actually useful. So well, I shouldn't say actually, but it's very practical. So it is a image magic policy evaluator open source tool. I just gave you the blog post, but I'm going to give the actual link to the GitHub repo so you can, because they have a live running site you can paste your policy into, but you can also run that same site. I think it's like a Python site, like a Django site, website locally, and then paste in the config. But anyways, there's the GitHub link too, and I'll put these in. I'll just put the GitHub link in Slack. So, anyways, I say that because, like, obviously we've had like plenty of RCs inside of ImageMagick. A lot of that's based off of what you allow in your config file. So you should go and use this tool if you're using ImageMagick. So yeah. Anyways, just wanted to put that out there.
Cool. All right. Okay. Well,
Cool.
I guess that's everything for today. See us at CactusCon or watch for the upcoming live streamed episode for, state of AppSec at CactusCon. And otherwise, we'll see everybody online.
So later. Thank you.